Hi everyone, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all at the Risk Awareness Week. As you know, this is a whole week of more than 50 different events dedicated to promoting some of the risk management practices and decision-making practices and decision science that we have to help decision makers make better decisions to help them achieve success. And it's a great pleasure for me to welcome as one of our speakers, Norman Marks. Norman Marks has been working in the industry for many, many years. He's been Chief Risk Officer, Chief Compliance Officer of major corporations. And even though he retired in 2013, he still blogs, writes, and speaks and does a lot of training and mentoring. And I highly encourage everyone who hasn't yet signed up to sign up to Norman Marks' blog. And it's really easy to find. It's Norman Marks' blog. And study some of his books. I mean, we will today talk about some of the key takeaways from his latest books, and I hope you'll find this very useful and entertaining. Norman Marks, just to finish up the introduction, Norman Marks is the fellow of OCEG, and he is an honorary fellow of the Institute of Risk Management in UK. And in 2018, he was introduced as the American Hall of Distinguished Practitioners for the Institute, for the Global Institute of Internal Auditors. So Norman, it's a great pleasure for us to have you with us to talk about decision-making, risk management, and success. Surprisingly, I mean, many of our listeners would understand soon why we talk about success and not dangers, threats, and risks. Norman, welcome, and thank you for participating in the Risk Awareness Week.
My pleasure, Alex. Great to join you for this.
And I wanted to really start our conversation with, because I mean, this is the beginning of the week, and we really want to set the foundation for the right mindset, because some of the presentations will be highly technical, some of the presentations will touch on very specific aspects of risk management or specific techniques or specific tools. Our discussion right now is really all about changing the mindset and setting the foundation for the whole week. So I mean, you've written so many books and so many articles on risk management. What's your key takeaway from the latest developments in this profession we call risk management, or the application of risk management to making decisions?
So Alex, let me tell you and everybody else about, in a sense, a little trick that I played on a group of risk officers at a very large organization, global organization that was meeting in the northwest of the United States last week. I started off by going to one of the individuals who had his mobile phone right there on the table. And I said, are you aware of all the risks related to owning and using a mobile phone? It could be monitoring your location. In fact, I tell anybody who has young children or teenage girls and young ladies in particular, turn off location services, because that has been used by people to attack, find and then attack ladies. We now have the latest news talking about the fact that some of these apps are actually monitoring what you're saying and doing without you realizing it. So carrying a phone is a high risk. So I said, you're a risk officer, you don't like risk. And everybody sort of agreed. I said, well, then give me your phone. Well, would he give me his phone? No, because there's a reason that people are willing to accept that risk, take that risk of using a phone. And that is because there is a reason to do it. And yet we tend to consider all of these things that might happen which are bad in isolation. And we don't think about the fact that there's justification for taking risk. And the risk practitioner just looks at one side so often, and instead of looking at both sides and helping people making decisions weigh all the consequences of what they're doing, what they're thinking, the different options, and coming up with what I call an informed and intelligent decision. The other thing is, and we were focusing especially on cyber-related risk. Everybody's terrified by cyber risk. You know, this week we've got a new Capital One breach where millions of people have had their social security numbers and personal information perhaps stolen, although hopefully not their credit card information. And people are getting upset by that and worried, and it's in all the news. But how significant really is cyber risk, and should we be looking at that in isolation? Because if you are thinking of running for business, you need to be thinking about, well, cyber is a risk. Everybody is telling me it's a huge risk, and it should be one of the top risks we identify and put money in and invest in addressing. But I don't have all the money in the world. Even this company that I was talking to, which is one of the richest companies in the world, doesn't have totally unlimited resources. So they have to decide, somebody has to decide how much is enough to put in there. And I've got competing demands for that money. I've got not only the need to put money into protecting myself or responding to a breach, but I'm thinking of opening up a new office. I'm thinking of a new marketing campaign. I'm thinking of developing new technology. Where do I need to be spending the money? And yet people keep looking at the cyber risk and come up with, and you mentioned the making sense of business technology risk, a list of information assets. It's a list of high risk, but how does that help me run the business? How does that help me decide where to invest or not to invest? So I think, and you mentioned this almost as a theme of your conference, is that it should be about managing for success, not managing individual things for preventing failure. The other thing which people, especially on the cyber side, tend to forget is, because you're looking at the silo of cyber,
Yep.
is if you're looking at, say, I mean, you live in Madrid, right? So if, let's say, you're starting a new company and you're thinking of setting up an office in Algeria, okay? Cyber is just one of the risks relating to whether it makes sense to open up an office there. Just
Yep.
one of the risks. And
Absolutely.
you need to, so in order to make decisions as to, do I go ahead, will the potential benefits outweigh the potential harms? I need to consider cyber, I need to consider personnel risk, I need to consider political and compliance risk, EU privacy risks. I've got all of these things to consider. We can't look just at one thing at a time. We've got to see the big picture. So it comes back down to, how can we help people make informed and intelligent business decisions?
Yeah.
Making risk decisions, it doesn't make sense to me.
And I think this is what you're alluding to, and I really want to, everybody who's watching us online right now, I really want to kind of drive that message. Is the only reason, I mean, we will actually have a lot of cyber presentations during this week, and I don't want to, for anyone to feel that we're picking on cyber. The only reason why we mention cyber is because it's super sexy at the moment. But the second reason why we mention cyber is because we have that feeling of deja vu. Exactly the same happened with foreign exchange risk. Exactly the same happened with vendor risk. It's just that, it's just that time of the year when a new risk is suddenly the talking point for everyone in the world. But in reality, and this is what I hope will become clear from this presentation and the next presentation and every presentation during this week, is that it's not about managing individual risks. It's about understanding everything that may have an impact on the success of the organization, on the achievement of the organizational objectives, and dealing with that, dealing with the effects of those uncertain events, be it cyber, be it operational, be it strategic or pricing or commodity or literally anything else. That's the very important message that I want people to take away from this kind of first introductory presentation. It's really becoming kind of apparent that it's less and less about risk per se than it is about actually how those risks, all of them, impact on the achievement of objectives or the success of the organization.
Absolutely. And the other thing, like we talked about, you've got to be able to weigh the pros and the cons. For example, if you're thinking of buying a new house, you don't just make a list of all the things that might go wrong and all the things you don't like. You make a list of all the things you do like and the things that may go well. If you're starting a new business, you think about costs and you think about personnel turnover, but you also think about revenue. And what troubles me so much is that the risk practitioner says, well, I'm only going to focus on the negative side. And somebody else, we hope, we think, is going to focus on the positive side. And yet that doesn't actually happen.
Mm.
So you've got a risk professional doing all kinds of disciplined, maybe modeling, and coming up with some analysis of all the potential downside. And on the other side, you've got maybe a strategy person, or maybe a CEO or head of sales, who is an eternal optimist,
Mm-hmm.
really not thought through the likelihood of things going right. So what's going on here? Are we actually helping people make informed and intelligent business decisions? And that's one of the problems, which is that we keep talking about this latest four-letter word, risk.
Mm-hmm.
And risk has such a negative connotation with everybody in more than one way. First of all, people think about it as only pertaining to the things that could go wrong. Whereas that's not what either COSO or ISO intend. It's what they write about, that's what they emphasize, but it's not what they actually intend. They actually talk about all the things that flow from uncertainty, the things that might happen in the future. So they focus on the negative aspect. And then also, most executives and board members do not see the value. And so you start talking about risk, and they click off. 80% of them think it's a compliance activity because they cannot see how it helps them run the business.
Mm-hmm.
And if they cannot see how it helps them run the business, why should they spend any time on it? Now, Alex, one of the things I talk about in the book and in my presentations is you want to persuade somebody to do something. And that's what we're really trying to do here. We're trying to inform people and persuade them to make an intelligent decision. We need to appeal to their WIIFM. Now, WIIFM is an English acronym, stands for what's in it for me. If people don't think there's anything for them to gain by listening to or reading or thinking about so-called risk, why would they spend any time on it? Other than they feel they have to fulfill some kind of compliance obligation.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if they can see that it is actually helping them be successful, that's something else totally entirely. I referred a lot to a Deloitte study where they asked executives and board members how many of them felt that, quote, risk management and practices are helping them set and then execute on business strategies. And it was distressing. Only 13% said yes, it definitely does help them. I was just looking, I mentioned this to you earlier.
Yeah.
There's a study by Boehringer Partners, and it talked about risk appetite statements. And 15% says the risk appetite statements are linked to the firm's strategy. In other words, there's a total disconnect with running the business to limit people how much risk they're taking.
Yeah.
And if in fact that's effective, and actually running the business. And only like 10% say that risk appetite statements influence decision making. So we're getting wrong because we're focusing on what traditional risk management is all about, instead of thinking about our customer, the leaders of the business, and figuring out what do they need.
Yeah. And this is, I think, this is where I want to take our discussion, because the trouble with risk management is that we continue doing what we've always been doing, and we're doing risk appetite statements. For example, I mean, it's actually kind of funny. I'm old enough, I guess, which is very unusual, but I'm old enough to actually remember when risk appetite statements first appeared on the scene. And it was back in, I think, like 2005 or something, or 2006. I was trying to search for the origin of the document. I was trying to find where is this coming from. And the only thing I found was a very, very early publication by Oliver Wyman, which is a consulting house, basically, saying that this looks like good practice and this is going to be best practice and everything else. And then it kind of, like most traditional risk management applications, like heat maps and like all the other things that don't have any scientific background behind it whatsoever, they just kind of spread, and then later the regulators picked it up and they started mentioning. And now your average board member expects to see a risk appetite statement. They're still as useless as they ever were, and still risk managers haven't figured out how to turn them into a useful decision-making tool, because limits and different kinds of tolerances were always in board level policies anyway. So risk appetite statement is, if anything, is a duplication. But still, we in this kind of vicious circle of just continuing to do that somebody somewhere came up with. Hopefully it was verified, but most of the time it actually wasn't. It was never validated or verified by the industry. So anyway, we just continue doing that. And that's a totally wrong approach. We really should be starting with asking the questions from the decision makers. What can we do to help them make their highly complex, highly uncertain decisions better? How can we help them improve the quality of the decision making? And I think this is what you're talking in your books about.
Absolutely, but I don't think we should throw that poor little baby out with all that bathwater. There are some situations where risk appetite makes sense, but they're limited. They're limited, and I think the root, the reason for coming up with something like this is that the people who owned the business or represented the owners of the business wanted to make sure that management wasn't, if you like, putting the whole company at risk in order to generate revenue and make their bonuses.
Sure.
So they didn't want the company and its management to be taking unnecessary risk. So they wanted to put some kind of constraint on that. And I can see that there has to be some way of satisfying the owners and the representatives on the board of the owners that the people are making prudent decisions. Now, this has been done in the past by making sure that certain decisions had to go to the board for approval. And I think that you need to understand what we're trying to do there. So in that respect, I think the intent is okay.
Yep.
What you got to look at is, for each company, how can we do that, and will that actually be effective?
Yep.
The risk appetite statement sounds good, seems good. It tends to be after the fact reporting rather than actually influencing decisions.
Mm-hmm.
The other side of it is when you are looking at, say, a financial portfolio, and you want to set some kind of criteria as to which, and you have personal experience on this with your background, Alex, personal experience in terms of what kind of trades, what kind of positions, what kind of strategies, what kind of granting of credit to customers and so on makes sense. And so you establish some limits, and I think that makes sense. I think also we need to forget that simple things like delegation of authority and spending limits are in fact risk appetite statements.
Absolutely, absolutely agree.
What are we trying to achieve? And then what's the right tool? It's risk appetite statements to me is like somebody buying the latest tool without figuring out what they need to do.
Mm-hmm.
And a risk appetite statement, as you and I both know, and I think everybody here, doesn't really influence the decisions made by the people in the trenches almost every minute of every day. And so there's a problem there. And that's what we need to focus on. What are we trying to achieve with this whole idea of risk management.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about limiting. It's not about stopping risk, because if we limit or eliminate risk, well, the only way to do that is get out of the business, because you cannot. I mean, business is all about taking risk.
Mm-hmm.
Even a government agency or not-for-profit. In fact, not-for-profits are taking huge risks all the time.
Yep.
But they have to be able to have some criteria as to what is the right level of the right risk to take
Mm-hmm.
if we want to be successful and achieve our objectives. And so I think we need to start with what are we trying to achieve in our company, in our organization, and then step back and throw that word risk out. It's like people ask me, what is effective risk management? And it's really helping people make effective and informed and intelligent decisions,
Mm-hmm.
understanding what might happen. But how can you do any decision? It's like I wrote recently that this idea of integrating strategy and risk just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Because how can you set strategy without thinking about what happens?
Yeah.
Or
You
might
shouldn't.
happen?
Most organizations do, but they really shouldn't.
Well, they absolutely, that's really not effective strategy setting. If you're not thinking, you've got to be thinking. And it's like when something goes wrong, your child or your subordinate does something wrong, one of the first things you say is, what were you thinking? You weren't thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And risk management is all, if we want to call it that, is all about helping people think through all the things that might happen. But isn't that just effective management? And I find it very difficult to start talking about risk management and as if it's something different from just being an effective manager. How can you be an effective manager if you don't have some kind of discipline over your decision making? If you don't have the ability to understand what might happen, to seek all the appropriate information that's relevant to your decision, taking the time when you need to, moving quickly when you have to make an appropriate decision, consulting with everybody that might be affected by your decision. All of these things are part of effective management.
Absolutely.
I mean, you run the company, you run the organization, you run your business. We decide what we're going to say. We decide what we're going to do all the time. Those are decisions. But how do we get that information? And so when we're talking about things like the latest ISO document, risk assessment techniques, and it's like, wait a minute. We're spending all of this time and money looking at the technical side of risk assessment techniques, focusing only on the things that might go wrong. But where's the guidance on how to weigh potential things that could go wrong, potential hazards, with potential benefits? I haven't seen ISO come up with any guidance on how to compare the likelihood of revenue growth with the likelihood of product dissatisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
And isn't that the core? I mean, what's the point of coming up with information like a risk assessment unless you tell people how to use it?
Absolutely.
And it's not there. ISO's not doing this. COSO's certainly not doing this. COSO went backwards. They decided, everybody criticizes us for having a list of risk and a risk register. So they just renamed it a risk portfolio.
Yeah, but profile, they call it risk profile.
Well, profile and portfolio, they have used both terms, yeah.
Which is bizarre. That's right, and that's why I think this is a very important message that we're trying to get across. Risk management is really no different to just making informed and intelligent decisions. It's just management. The reason why we still kind of call it risk management, and maybe not for long. I mean, maybe we will soon stop calling it risk management, and I hope we do. And the only reason why we do that is that a lot of research in neuroeconomics, so in the biology of how brain works, and in probability theory, so in the kind of the mathematical side of the world and trying to compute the effect of uncertainty, those schools of thought have actually came up with quite serious findings. Is that managers should be thinking about risk and should be making intelligent decisions, but many don't. Not because they're bad managers, but because that's how that's how evolution built us. And our brain is designed to take shortcuts. And unless we know how to stop and think and make ourselves kind of switch to from system 1 to system 2 thinking, we probably will fall into one of many different cognitive biases, which may significantly reduce the quality of the decision that we are making. Plus another kind of aspect of the foundation research that we have behind risk management is everything to do with probability theory, which basically teaches us that thinking about the future which may be influenced by millions different interconnected and independent factors, is actually highly, highly complex. Future is unpredictable, for a reason. And the best we can do is we can come up with estimates, we can come up with potential scenarios, we can come up with possible visions for what different futures may hold. And again, even that fundamental message is lost with many managers, is that there is no single future. Future is plural. There's no just one future. Just because you put we will generate 100 million revenue, but then that's what's going to happen. There are unmeasurable amounts of possible futures, and we don't know which one will actually happen. We know which ones are more likely, which ones are less likely, and so on. So those two kind of fundamental sciences behind thinking about the future, so it's kind of, it adds that layer of complexity. It seems that if we just rely on our intuition and our experience, we may not make the best possible decision. And that's why we still use sometimes risk management, which is our go-to tool to help make a sense of the future, of the uncertainties in the future, and help us make sense of the different cognitive biases that affect our decision making. And in that sense, we as decision makers, we can make quick and easy decisions using our gut or intuition, but knowing that if the cost of that decision, if the significance of that decision is high, and knowing all the kind of potential flaws in the normal human decision-making process, it's a good idea to rely at least on some of the tools. And if we are going to rely on some of the tools in risk management, why not rely on good tools in risk management that actually show exactly what you're talking about? We always use ranges to represent the future outcomes, ranges that show both positive scenarios and negative scenarios. So we always, when we report risk, we always report risk as the likelihood of achieving objective, the likelihood of exceeding objective, and the likelihood of really, really bad scenarios. So we're kind of trying to give the decision makers all three pieces of the puzzle, saying this is the likelihood of something amazing happening, this is the likelihood of what you promised the shareholders happening, and this is the likelihood of something really horrible happening. And that hopefully influences and helps them make a different or a better decision.
Right, and I'm glad you brought up that particular example, because that's something I write about in my book. Is I start off with what are the objectives we're trying to achieve. Now, considering all the things that might happen, both the good and the bad, what's the likelihood we'll fall short? What's the likelihood we'll achieve? And what's the likelihood we will go over? And then that is now, there's a lot of detail behind that in terms of the specific sources of risk, both opportunity and hazard, if you like, go into that. And that takes some work. But that kind of information presented to a decision maker will allow them to ask a lot of questions. What can we do to increase this? What can we do to reduce that? What can we do to increase the likelihood of exceeding our objective? There's nothing wrong with that. Alex, I've been in executive committee meetings many times in my life, and I'm very used to the CFO getting up and presenting to the executive committee the forecast for the next few months, maybe for the rest of the year. And nobody asks, well, when it comes to revenue, what's the likelihood of achieving that? What can we do to go over that? What's the possibilities that will go under that? And starting to have some questions around it. But I think we have to be very, very careful placing too much reliance and confidence in what is really a fairly frail foundation. So the numbers that come out of a risk management tool are not certain. I spent some time in World-Class Risk Management, that book, talking about the risks of a poor risk management process.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that you have all these cognitive biases which get in the way of interpreting the data and actually coming up with an estimate. The fact that people are not honest.
Yep.
The fact that people don't even participate. I was at one company where, which I won't name, where the senior vice president responsible for the risk management software product refused to meet with a risk management specialist to discuss risks. So even though she was responsible for a product to help risk practitioners, she didn't believe in applying a risk management kind of approach to the development process.
Yeah.
So you've got the failure to do that. You've got the, as we all know, the possibility of bad or incomplete data, unreliable data. And so it's really important, I think, for anybody responsible for risk management reporting, assessment processes, to actually do a hard look and apply some of that same thinking to their own processes and how reliable are they, and stop trying to think about the risk is 3.77. Well, you can't be that kind of precise with it.
Risk is never a single number. It's always a range.
It's always a range. But even that, let's say your willingness to put your own money at risk is, for a certain reward, is, let's say, €5,000. Does it really matter if the risk assessment comes in and says that the possibility of losing that you might lose 10,000 or 20,000? You're not going to take the risk.
Yeah.
So the actual, it's more important to have a person making the decision know, is this a risk I need to take or not, rather than this is the precise risk value. A model or anything else like that is only as good as the information that goes into it.
Absolutely.
And I think that risk practitioners and the people relying upon risk-related information don't do enough work thinking about where does this all information come from, and can I present it in a way that is meaningful to the person making the decision.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, we talked about, and this is in the book, in the Making Business Sense of Technology risk book, when it comes to cyber, that you've got a range potential of results and effects. One of the things which is really interesting, which may stun many of the people here, is the average cost of a cyber breach, direct, indirect, is less than $3 million. That's the average. But it ranges from the most likely being about $1.25 million to the enormous ones where it's 300, 700 million or more when you account for the fines. So you can't, a breach could result in temporary loss of information, graffiti on a web page, all the way to loss of data, to theft of your IP, enormous range of potential. And yet we tend to fix one point. Some people say, well, let's just consider the worst possible alternative. So they focus on the $50 or $100 million potential loss. But as one of the reviews on my book commented, well, what if you've got a $1 million loss that occurs 20 times each year? So you've got this death by 1,000 cuts. You really got to think about that whole thing. So what do you present to the decision maker? 1 point, on a heat map, really not telling them anything because they're trying to get an objective achieved. And it's knowing something is a high risk doesn't tell them whether to take that risk or not. Or do you show them the full range of potential results? And you don't want to overwhelm somebody with information, but I think you need to give them the information they need and certainly consider showing them the full range of potential results. But again, it's got to come back down to what are they trying to achieve? And telling them that something is a high risk to what? High risk to the company, high risk to the project, high risk to this customer.
Yep.
And how much is it worth me spending on this risk versus that risk? It's still not helping me make the business decision.
And this is, I think, where we've just picked up, I want to highlight it to all the people listening to us, because we've just picked up on two fundamental messages. One is mathematically and just common sense. Risk is not a single number. It's actually a range of possible outcomes. So it makes much more sense to communicate in ranges or give more information to the decision makers than just give them a single number. And that's why heat maps as a kind of traditional, most common tool in risk management kind of immediately falls short because we have other better ways of communicating uncertainty. Now that's point number one. But a much more important point is what you've alluded to. It's actually much more meaningful to the decision makers not to communicate the range of potential losses or losses from a risk or potential outcome from a risk. It's actually much more meaningful to represent how these risks, many risks, affect the decision or the target or the objective or the KPI. So it basically makes more sense to, instead of saying this risk can be from big to small, to say that if this risk happens, your budget may be reduced by X to Y, or your delay may be between 5 and 7 months, or the NPV from this project is not 100 as you anticipated, it may be somewhere between 70 and 105. So it's actually much more meaningful. And again, this is surprisingly, this is a very difficult concept for many risk practitioners to appreciate, is that it actually makes much more sense to not communicate the risk per se, because this is not what decision makers are interested in. And I mean, decision makers watching us right now, I highly encourage you to write in the comments whether you think we're onto something here or not. It's much more valuable to the decision makers to show how uncertainty will affect something that is meaningful to them, be it budget, cost of a project, time frame of the project, NPV, IRR, or whatever metric, literally any metric. Maybe it's revenue. There's a revenue target, and we can say that due to different risks, this revenue target will not be achieved, and this is by how much. And there's a very small possibility that it will be exceeded. And again, we can say by how much. We can do all sorts of calculations. But the point I'm trying to get across is that it's actually much more meaningful when talking to decision makers to talk about effect of risk on something, as opposed to the risk as itself, as an entity.
Alex, let me modify a little bit. First of all, don't talk about risk at all.
Yes.
Use business language. Use the language that they are used to make it meaningful. And let me tell you a story. You may have heard this yourself before, but at one point in one of my companies where I was running internal audit, the team went into a factory in Shenzhen that's just on the mainland near Hong Kong. And I was looking at the draft audit report, and it was a table that had the areas of risk they were looking at, like quality management, financial reporting, information security, financial reporting, and so on. Well, 7 or 8 really important areas that they were looking at. And then there was assessment using traditional traffic light, red, yellow, green, as to whether that risk was being properly addressed. and then some description of the number of issues that was significant. And I was looking at this, and it was printed on glossy paper, okay? And I picked it up, and I was blinded by the red. Because it was all red on glossy paper, and I could hardly read the words because everything was red. I called up my director in Singapore and said, Audrey, what does this mean? And so she told me, well, the controls aren't good. There's potential problems in quality management, customer relationships, control of inventory, procurement, certainly information security. As we didn't talk about cyber in those days, but same thing.
Yep.
Yes, but what does it mean? And so I asked her to call me back the next day and tell me what she would say if the CEO approached her and said, come with me, we're going to go down from the 4th down to the ground floor and tell me what I need to know about the audit in Shenzhen. And she called me back and said, I think I've got it. I would tell him, you have a strategy for the region to move operations out of Singapore and China to Shenzhen so that these other facilities can be repurposed. That strategy is likely to fail because the operations in the Shenzhen, China will not support the customer relationships and support the revenue and the product quality going forward. That is talking in business language. That is appealing to the WIIFM of the operating management, and that is talking to them in a way which is relevant, meaningful, current, and timely. We talked before about maybe changing the name of risk management. As you know, I've written this book, Risk Management in Plain English, which is all about, and it's for executives trying to explain what this is all about and how we should stop using the word risk. Because you can say the same thing without using the R word. You'll convey all the messages you need to without using that highly politically biased word. And one of the people wrote into my blog and said that he had problems sitting down with the executives and talking about risk. He changed the name of his team to Decision Support.
Yep.
Very simple change. And now everybody is willing to listen and talk, and he doesn't use the word risk, but he's still doing the same thing. But he's now being recognized as actually helping people succeed. And I think that effective risk management, two tests. One of them is where the executives say that, yes, it is helping me, whatever it is we call it, it is helping me set and execute a strategy. And second test, this is like an ethics test. People do this with ethics as well, is where people are taking the right risk without the risk practitioner being there.
Mm-hmm.
Because they know how to make decisions. They know how to go through the process. They know how to be thinking about what might happen and assessing it and determining whether it's adequate, and then comparing all the things that might happen, weighing them, balancing them against each other to take the right risk going forward.
Yeah, and this is a very, very important message for everyone who's listening to us. To measure how effective risk management is in the organization is actually very simple. If decisions made by top management or middle management or staff are actually considerate of uncertainty and risk, then it's a good indication that risk management is probably effective. If whatever risk manager is doing is only used for quarterly or annual reporting and is mainly done because the shareholders want to see something or the external or internal auditors are requesting something, if whatever the risk managers are producing has no meaningful impact on the actual decision-making process within the organization, as in the budgets have already been set, the strategy has been approved, and then a month later a risk manager comes up with his risk analysis, that's a pretty good indication that this is not a very effective risk management. Even though it may look flashy, may use the best sophisticated software, if it's done after the decisions have been done and signed off, it's probably not that effective. So I just want to kind of quickly pivot that to the decision makers again. Decision makers have this wealth of knowledge within the organization sitting in their risk management departments, which I think are generally underutilized, because risk managers are mainly spending their time on doing what I call risk management one, which is basically satisfying all the external requirements and whatever the law says, whatever the regulators, the auditors, the insurance companies, the banks, the board members are asking for. That's important, and there's a place for it. But none of that really helps the decision makers. So I think the kind of it's obviously on risk managers to help the decision makers and to promote what they have to offer. But the decision makers that are listening to us do encourage risk managers, or ask the risk managers what can they do to improve the quality of decision making within the organization. Can they apply some of their tools or techniques, or mathematical knowledge, or knowledge of psychology? Can they apply some of those trade crafts to help make the decision-making process better within the organization? Look at specific decisions, or help choose between options that are unclear, whether one is better than the other. I mean, the best example I remember from one of the friends of mine in Russia. He was the head of risk of a huge telecom company, and they were deciding for a location for a new data center. And on paper, everybody was about to sign off for it. Moscow, biggest city in Russia, was the obvious choice. And they've done the calculations, the finance team done the calculations, the operational team done the calculations, IT team has done the analysis. It seemed like the better option. And because they were trying to introduce this new quality decision making into the organization, the risk analysis then done their job, and they compared different scenarios, they compared different risks that may affect the various locations. And of course, instead of a single number, they came up with ranges. And they actually put one range on top of the other range and compared which option gives them less risk, because this is ultimately what decision making is all about, trying to reduce uncertainty to something that is manageable or acceptable to the decision makers. So anyway, the end of the point of the story, what seemed like an obvious, guaranteed 100% choice on paper was actually disproved by risk analysis. And it turned out St. Petersburg, which is the second biggest city in the country, turned out to be a much better option because it has less risk. Same amount of money approximately, but less risk. And hence the company actually changed their decision to select something which was less risk, but based on proper risk analysis.
I think we've got to be careful, again, always assuming that there's only a negative side that needs to be considered.
Sure.
And what opportunities might be presented by building out an operation in St. Petersburg versus Moscow, and in the big picture of running the organization. Maybe by setting it up in St. Petersburg, there's an opportunity to move additional staff and functions there and save money, maybe go closer to some customers, maybe acquire another piece of the business that was complement and the staff is there. So again, we're not about managing risk.
Yes.
We're about managing the success.
Yes.
And it's really hard for technical-oriented people to be able to sit back and put themselves in the seats, in the shoes of the people running the business and say, okay, now what would I do if I was running the organization?
True, very true.
Because there was another alternative, Alex, which was to outsource everything. And maybe there'll be an opportunity there. Maybe there'll be an opportunity to add additional functionality, increase this or that or the other. Maybe there's also a possibility that they could defer the spending and take that additional capital and invest it in something.
Yep.
So this is what the CEO and the board have to decide all the time. I remember that many years ago, I and my team did an audit of a data center in Northern California.
Mhm.
And we had some significant cyber-related, information security-related problems. And the board was absolutely stunned when I said, I recommend you do not do anything about it. And the reason was that they were going to move their operations to the other side of the country. And investing in Northern California simply didn't make business sense. And so it's not about risk sense. It's not about limiting risk. It's about what makes the most business sense. And sometimes you actually need to take more risk.
Yeah.
You need to take more risk because you can't afford to be late to market. You can't afford to let your competitors take over because you're reluctant to roll out a new product because it's not quite perfect. You can't afford to delay, for example, the release of a new product because it's at a level of concern. Because maybe now your customers will choose a different product because they're waiting, and they won't wait any longer. Maybe you'll lose this opportunity or that opportunity. So we live in a different world these days. We live in a very dynamic, turbulent world. And we need to be able to make decisions faster. And that means sometimes we have to take the risk that our risk information is incomplete.
Yep.
But we have to make decisions and we have to make them at speed. And that means sometimes we have to be willing to take more risk. We can't, in the past, we used to have this saying, do not be on the bleeding edge. Well, now sometimes you have to be on the bleeding edge because that's the right thing to do for the business.
Mm-hmm.
And the risk practitioner has got to be conscious that they are, by profession and inclination, highly risk averse. And if you're not careful, being risk averse can slow the business down. Risk practitioners, especially in financial services, have a very bad reputation as being people that stop the organization from succeeding, stop the practitioner, stop the trader from running the business and being successful. Our business should not be to stop them. Our business should be to help them to take the right level of risk. And we should be prepared to step back and say, yes, you're right. It is appropriate to take that level of risk, even though it is beyond what we have in the past considered to be the right level of risk, because it's the right thing to do for the business.
Yep. Yep.
I
have some. I totally agree with you, and I have some interesting statistic to back up this point. Over the 3 years I was the head of risk of one of the sovereign funds, the company was making between 5 and 15 decisions every week. So that's a total of many hundreds of decisions that were being made. And for most of those decisions, we have actually done risk analysis. And interestingly, out of thousands of risk analyses that we've done for the decisions, twice we said emphatic no. Twice we actually had to write like a letter saying, please don't do this. These are the reasons why it seems like the risk level is just way beyond our appetite or the shareholders' appetite or the government's appetite. But every other time, so it's many thousands minus 2, every other time we actually said to achieve the objective or the goal that you've set yourself or the promise that you've made, you have to make this decision differently. And this is a very different conversation. We never said don't do it unless it was absolutely important to say don't do it because it was toxic. Most of the time we actually said go ahead, do it, but do it slightly differently. Put additional information in the legal documents, take precaution, take steps, structure it differently, do it differently to achieve the objectives that you set out to achieve.
Let me tell you another story. So one of my companies, a software company, revenue recognition is number 1, number 2, and number 3 level of concern. And in order to qualify revenue to be recognized, there's a number of things have to happen. It has to be approved by credit, also has to be reviewed and approved by the legal department. Well, our legal department was getting buried in software deals that they had to approve. My team went in and we actually recommended that they take more risk on the smaller deals in order to free up the attorneys to spend more time on other business risks. And so, again, we got to stop this session with managing and mitigating risk. It's about taking risk, but taking the right level of risk. Sometimes it's right to take the risk and take more risk because that's the right thing to do for the business. And just one more story, because I know we're running out of time here, Alex. But I work for one company, SAP, where they recognized a few years ago that the underlying technology upon which they had built their ERP and their many successful systems was becoming obsolete. And they decided that they needed to explore, and they invested in and found new technology which would enable this software to run hundreds, if not thousands of times as fast. And they made the decision that they had to move all of their existing products, or at least the functionality, onto the new platform and not support changes on the old platform at all, even if their customers were not willing to spend the additional money to move. They had to put the whole company, if you like, at risk. The success and viability of the whole organization was at risk because they're going to move to this totally new technology. Now, were the shareholders going to be pleased with putting the whole company at risk? No, but they had to go through a process of communicating and selling the idea that they had to take this huge, huge risk, but it was the right business decision to take. And fortunately, the company has done very well with that. And I congratulate, I was not part of that team, that management team, but I congratulate them on being willing to take the right level of risk, even if it's over the chart. I mean, it just wouldn't fit on a 2x2 or 3x3 risk matrix, right? Because it's just way out there.
Yes, well, that's why good risk managers use 5x5. Some would say, but no, of course I'm kidding.
Yeah, 5x5, and show the context of how this matters to each business objective, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But I think that we've got to, every risk practitioner's got to remember that their title may be risk, their responsibility may be risk, but they should be people who are helping run the business first. And they're not there to manage risk, they're there to help the company as a whole be successful. And so in order to do that, I have to understand what the company is trying to achieve, what the decision makers are trying to decide upon, and then can they tailor the information and present it in a way and at a time that is useful for that decision maker to make the right decision.
Yeah. Now that is a very important message, and I hope all the risk practitioners that are listening to us now have really understood that. I mean, you will have the recording to watch, so make sure you wind back and watch this point now, because what Norman said is absolutely critical for the risk managers to change their mentality from managing risk. I mean, somebody must have made a mistake when they called risk management, because it's really not about managing risk per se, with the only exception of risk that you have to manage by law. It's much more about helping companies succeed by taking appropriate level of risk and understanding what level of risk is being taken. So for many, this is a huge mental shift from what the risk managers are doing right now. And during this week, during the Risk Awareness Week, you will see many, I mean, dozens of additional presentations and workshops and talks by different decision scientists and risk practitioners that will continue to encourage and reinforce that message. It's not about managing risks per se, again, with some exceptions. It's much more about helping companies take informed and intelligent decisions, taking risks into account. Now, Norman, I just wanted to finish on something also important. Can you maybe share some messages for the decision makers themselves? because we've been talking a lot about the risk managers, and there's a lot of work for the risk practitioners to do. They have to change their mindset. They have to change the way they present information. They have to change their assess risk. I mean, to begin with, that's also big. But what would your advice be for the decision makers in the organizations?
So the way I look at it, Alex, is that the risk people, the people who are in that function, even if they're called decision support instead of risk practitioner, they're there to help. They have tools, they have capabilities in terms of thinking through, helping you think through what might happen, understanding all the options that you're considering, and then looking at, assessing, analyzing, and providing you with useful information. So now you can consider all the different sources of potential hazard, sources of potential benefits, and weigh them against each other to be able to compare and make an intelligent decision. Use them as a resource. Tell them what you need to know. Tell them what kind of decisions you're making when. Then task them with giving them useful information which will help you make the right decision. And it's not, if you like, if you don't want to talk, Mr. Decision or Mrs. Decision Maker, about risk, just talk about being successful. You want to be successful in achieving your objective in a wise and prudent fashion, which is more likely to succeed than not. That's what it really comes down to. And so, how can they help you do that? And don't just give me a piece of the puzzle on the left-hand side or the negative side. Help me understand and use the same discipline to understand the positive side as well. I don't understand why some people say that they can only look at hazards and they can't look at opportunities the same way. The same disciplines, the same process, the same tools can be used to look at all of these. And in some situations, people like our friend Martin Davies will say that you can use mathematical techniques to pull all these numbers together. I'm not sure you want to do that necessarily, but it really comes down to having the confidence in the information so you can make the right business decision.
Yeah. And I wanted to finish up on another interesting statistic. A group of scientists, which I can't remember who, but I've read about them in a recent book. A group of scientists tested 130 executive decisions. And what they found is 70% of the time, the decisions were binary. What this means is basically do something or don't do something. Well, the future is actually a little bit more complex than that. There are always multiple options. There's always an option, do nothing. But then there are multiple options of doing something. You can do A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I mean, in fact, when we were dealing with some liquidity problems at the company where I was the head of risk, we ended up going with option J. So we went through different future possibilities, and we actually ended up going with option J because none of the others were worked or optimal or possible. So life is in future is very uncertain, highly complex, and yet people without the proper application of risk management tools, they really limit themselves to just two options: do something or do nothing. Leaving a lot of value on the table and not really kind of doing the best for themselves as decision makers, and for the shareholders, obviously not doing the best for the shareholders. So risk analysis can help because it actually broadens the view significantly. It gives much more options to the decision makers to help them pick not something that seems obvious, but something that is probably actually a better, more optimal option going forward. Any other final thoughts, Marwan?
I just one thing. It is very easy to say, think out of the box. And certainly we should all be challenging our thinking and our practices. Why are we doing this? And to understand, are we doing it just because we've always done it? Or are we doing it because somebody tells us it's best practice? Or are we doing it because we know that this is the right thing to do? And if we come up with a new and better way of doing things, don't create a new box for ourselves by doing that. Every so often, we've got to be able to get out of the box, kick down that box, and then just continue to operate it as if it was a box all the time, constantly challenging ourselves. I'm encouraged by gentleman Felix Kloman, who's been in this business longer than probably you have been alive, certainly close to how long I've been alive. And even in his, I think, late 80s, early 90s, he still portrays himself as somebody who's learning about how to do this business that we're in, which is to help people understand what might happen and take the right level of risk. We always need to be challenging ourselves. Is this the best way to meet our customers' needs?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Norman. I hope you found this enjoyable, watching us share our thoughts and ideas about moving away from risk management towards informed and intelligent decision making. And I highly encourage you to ask questions in the chat below. We will collate all those questions and respond to it individually, or respond to it online. And do discuss it with one another. Encourage you to communicate with other participants. Make this this week a very interactive session. I'll obviously talk a lot about this in other videos as well. So thank you very much, and enjoy this week, and help spread the message. Make this a true risk awareness week. Bring this to the attention of the decision makers in your organization. Thank you, and we'll see you in next sessions.